responsibilities that you were a parent?
Oh, yeah. I totally remember. Yeah. It's hard to lead industries and like get somebody to give you a chance to do something, but I'll figure it out. It's be fine. But then my husband is getting his associates in programming, or his bachelor's in programming.
Oh,
But he'll have
computer.
better luck than I
Yeah,
do,
yeah, yeah.
Probably.
Yeah.
Be fine.
How much more time does he have on?
He has 3 more years.
It's a while.
Yeah. He's basically taking like his class at a time.
Oh, okay.
For
No,
him.
he retired a couple of years before me, like 6 years.
Yeah.
No, yeah, he left. I forget when. Well before COVID.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, he did some lawyering work. He always kept his law degree, pro bono stuff. But he's kind of let that lapse a little bit.
Please give him a hug.
I
Okay.
will, I will, I
Do
will.
you- Do you, are you on our, you get our weekly 12?
This week and beyond.
This week and beyond.
Is what it
No,
says.
I'm
Would you like to
new.
be put on the
Sure,
list?
sure.
I've been tried doing the standard like 4 or 5 classes. He only passed one of them. So we learned from this lesson. Now he's only taking me one at a time to get handle,
Uh-huh.
and so it's very just slow and steady. Which
Okay.
we can do. So we'll be okay though.
Let's see if I can share my screen.
Lot of
here.
mixed emotions.
There we go.
So,
Want to start?
Sure.
Best ones.
Turn the volume up here. All right, hopefully technology is working in our favor this morning.
I can hear you.
Oh, good, good. Well, I don't think we have anyone who was not with us for Shabbat morning stuff. So hello again. Welcome back. And today we're going to take a look at responsa literature. It's a type of legal Jewish literature that originated in the Orthodox realm, but has since, and not even that recently, been moved into the Reform and conservative worlds.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. And responsa literature it's a type of Jewish legal or halakhic literature that's really characterized by question and answer. So it's when somebody has a question about Jewish law and they reach out usually to a rabbi or to more in the Reform and conservative realms, a group of scholars or rabbis to say what's the law in this situation. And usually it has to do with a new thing that has arisen that isn't covered in the Talmud or in some more ancient texts. So the example I use the most is when electricity came about, and that was a new thing. People wanted to know, is this something that we can use on Shabbat or not, right? Assuming you practice Shabbat in a traditional way where there is a prohibition against lighting a fire, they said, what is this electricity? Does it count as something that would be prohibited on Shabbat or not? And so the rabbis look into what electricity is, what it means to turn something on and turn something off, and try to apply ancient texts to this new thing. As those who know what Orthodox practice is around Shabbat might assume that the rabbis ruled that yes, completing a circuit or turning on a light is in essence starting a fire, and that is something that's prohibited on Shabbat, and so people should not do that on Shabbat if they are practicing in a traditional way. So that's sort of how responsa literature works. So the rabbis then give their answer, citing text and talking about how this text applies to the new situation.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Is it mostly the Orthodox who do that, or do, because I can't imagine like a Reformed Jew would have to ask their local rabbi whether or not something is kosher, for lack of a better word.
Right.
but-
So the way this started is people asking individual rabbis, usually like, somebody who had high stature in a certain area, or a rabbi that these people trusted, and that was usually in the Orthodox realm. And then a rabbi would usually actually publish their responses in a body of work. And so there are collections of rabbinic responsa that were disseminated throughout the Jewish world for hundreds of years. This was only in what we would now call the Orthodox setting. But nowadays, there is a committee on law and standards in the conservative movement. And the conservative movement does consider itself an halachic movement, one that is bound by Jewish law, although applied in the face of modernity and in conversation with modernity. The Reform movement does not really consider itself a halachic movement. That is, it's not bound by Jewish law. And yet there is a body of Reform responsa that we'll actually take a look at some of that and try to figure out why it's there.
But that's probably more in response to the conservative or Orthodox responsa as opposed to a question that was posed to the Reform.
No, people can pose questions to the responsa committee of the CCAR, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, which is the Reform Rabbinic movement, as a way of saying, how can Jewish tradition inform this particular situation? And it's a way of saying, does the Reform movement have ritual, liturgical, religious standards that we might be able to point to? I think there's a misunderstanding about Reform Judaism that it's, Judaism light. There, to say that I'm very Reformed means I don't do very much, and Judaism does not have a prime place in my life. Whereas if we look at what the institutions have said Reform Judaism is that it's not Judaism light. It is a reinterpretation of traditional Judaism that is guided by certain values. And so we might say, okay, then if we are taking these values as things that are important to us and that guide our religious lives, how do these values then apply to these certain situations? And so that's why I think people ask the responsa committee in the Reform movement for certain rulings. Not that anyone's coming after anyone if they don't abide by those rulings. But as a way of saying, how do our values and our tradition inform this? If we want to do this from in a Jewish framework and from that foundation, how might we then act in this particular moment?
And is there codification of these responses today? And are we talking about just three general groups? Does Reconstructionism have its own responses?
So
Israel different than the United States, etc.
Right. So each body essentially has its own way of doing things. And still in the Orthodox world, you have individual rabbis who might write responsa and publish them. You might have Orthodox groups that do that, like in open Orthodoxy or modern Orthodoxy. You might have a rabbinic group that comes up with a ruling. In the conservative movements, there is a rabbinic association. There's a subgroup, which is the Committee on Law and Standards. I think the local person who is most active in that is Aaron Alexander at Addis Israel, one of the senior rabbis there. And then in the reform movement, there's the responsa committee that people can ask of.
And which denomination were you become a rabbi in?
Reform. Yeah. So I wanted
So you're a
to,
Rabbi Light.
Okay.
yes, exactly.
It's much easier
Okay,
for them to hear.
okay.
Okay. So I wanted to look at a few different responsa today. One, as you can see on the screen, about Hanukkah, just as a way of seeing how it actually works, and sort of our introduction to responsa. This one comes from the Reform movement. You can see the CCAR up there in the corner, that logo. And then I wanted to look at one from the conservative movement, about something entirely new, to show you how that functions, and also, what the difference of what it looks like in the Reform movement versus the conservative movement. The hint is that length is is a big difference in what you see, but also, of course, the conclusions that different groups come to is a difference, and we'll go from there. I also have a number of responsa, mainly from the Reform movement, on issues that are facing the LGBTQ plus community. So I hope to get to at least one of those, although I think I have 4. And we'll see how far we get, because this is a body of literature, and there's a lot to cover. And as you'll see, even the shorter ones are pretty long. So I'll kind of summarize and highlight, and rather than have us read through all of this legal literature. But the first one I wanted to look at, you can see, comes from a question from somebody whose initials are W or VWK from Pittsburgh, who is talking about a menorah that somebody is making, right? A Hanukkah menorah that's modernistic. And it's basically flat metal lattice work, and at the various points where the metal bars cross each other, a cup is placed for the Hanukkah candle. Thus, the menorah, when full of lights, would present a square of lights instead of a line of lights. Is such a nonlinear menorah acceptable according to the spirit of the legal tradition? So that's an interesting way to word the question, even, right? Not even, is this like a halachically acceptable menorah, right? Is this a legal menorah? But is it acceptable in the spirit of the legal tradition? And so what the committee writes is, saying, they start off and say, look, based on what you've explained, it does not sound like an acceptable menorah, based on our tradition, and here's why. Right? And they say, in the tradition, there, we have lights all in a row, and that is what is the ideal menorah. And then they give some citations for that. So they have, and these are not specifically Reform thinkers, right? This is from throughout Jewish tradition. It could be biblical proof text they bring. It could be Talmudic. It could be medieval, as we see more here, right? That Jacob, can come on it. That the Maharil in the 14th century said that the Shamash in the synagogue in Mainz had arranged the lights irregularly, or as he said, from inward and some outward. And so he told them to rearrange them so they were all in a straight row, right? And so this is something that we have from the 1300s that says that they should all be in a straight row. That's our ideal. And he says, right, that it shouldn't be like a hearth. So that's the general guiding thought behind it. And then he goes to somebody who's based it on the Talmud, who says that that somebody placed the candles around the edge of a dish, and that's not suitable. The lights have to be fully separate and distinct, each one. So that's another ideal that we So we need to be careful to put things in a row and not a circle because we don't want it to look like a bonfire. We want it to be more like a candelabra. So so there's said, look, based on these ideals that we have from Jewish tradition, it seems like this menorah that you're describing is not going to be good for Hanukkah. But then they complicate things, right? So they say, but if maybe that the Maharil, it wasn't actually a legal requirement, it was just a preference. So maybe we can't base a ruling on somebody's preference. So then let's look elsewhere. And then we have this idea of the hearth. Is that a preference, or is that really a legal ruling? And then they say, you know what, there's another reason for it being linear rather than bunched. And that's because you have to light the lights in a certain order, right? Going from right to left. And if it's in a square, then how do you do that? And so they start to examine that and say, well, what's the reason for this? And is that something that we actually have to do or not? And they say that the linear arrangement is customary and might be preferable, but there's some dispute there, right? There's some wiggle room. So they're looking for a way to say yes, it seems, right? They didn't just give a flat out no. And then they talk about what Rabbi Ellenson talked about in the piece I shared earlier today, right? About Hillel versus Shammai and the sequence of lights, right? That Shammai says that you begin with 8 lights on the first day and diminish, whereas Hillel says you begin with 1 and you increase the light. And what he's saying is whichever one you follow, Hillel or Shammai, is that the lights have to be distinguishable from the preceding and succeeding day's lights, so that the 7th day has to be different than the 6th day, has to be different than the 5th day, no matter which ruling you follow, right? That it's not just that you light 8 candles every single day. And so he's going into these different opinions, these different pieces of Jewish thought throughout the ages, and trying to figure out what is really the point here and how does it apply, right? How does it apply to what's going on right here to this very question? And so if this lattice work square menorah has lights that are distinguishable from one another, and there's a sequence that you could light them in, then maybe you can use it. Right? This is sort of the turning point of the ruling, where if you just read the first chapter, you're saying, oh, this isn't going his way. Now it's saying, well, maybe it might go a different direction. And then they introduce another requirement of the menorah, which is that you can't derive benefit from the lights. You can't read by the light of the menorah. You can't use the fire from the first candle to light a flame on your stove, or even to light your Shabbat candles. That those 8 candles, let's say on the 8th day, you can't derive benefit from them. They're only there for ritual purposes and for beauty. And that's why, by the way, you have the shamash, right? You have the helper candle, because that one is not officially part of the 8, and that one you can derive benefit from. So, and that shamash then has to be distinguishable from the others. Right? That's why a lot of menorahs have the shamash up higher than the other ones, or separated out. And so if he's saying, if this menorah that you're asking about has a shamash that is distinguishable from the other candles, then that might not be an issue here. And so finally we get to the ruling, right, towards the end. And he says, of course, the usual linear type of menorah has become traditional and it fulfills all the requirements of the law, but that fact does not necessarily exclude other possible arrangements for the lights. The acceptability of a new type of Hanukkah lamp will depend upon whether or not the new type fulfills the requirements of the law. If, therefore, this new menorah has its lights well apart so that they do not look like a single bonfire, if the progress from day to day of the 8 days of the festival is clear at a glance, and if the shamash is distinguishable from the other lights, there is no real objection to its use for Hanukkah. So it took a long time to get there, right? This is like, just give me
Right,
the
and then
answer.
It says, but it depends.
It's just, right. This is like, when the math teacher says, show your work, right? So in responsive, they show their work. And they show you how they got to the answer rather than just giving you a ruling. And for this reason, a lot of people see responsive literature as not necessarily directed towards your Jew in the pew, but this is rabbis writing for other rabbis, maybe trying to impress them with how they got to that answer, maybe showing them, why it's actually okay to use this menorah when you might assume that it's not okay. But then this, by the way, in the Reform movement is a simplified version of responsa. In the Orthodox world, there are a lot of people use a lot of acronyms and sort of insider talk and a lot of different citations from different places. And it's very hard to follow because it's not meant for everybody to follow, right? It's really meant for a specific audience. But so you see how this one question of this new thing that came about, they draw from different parts of tradition and then try to apply those values and those ideas to what's going on in the
In
world.
some ways, it's like the Supreme Court interpreting the Constitution.
Right.
And there are some
Right.
originalists and, some.
Right. And they write their opinions and they cite all
yeah.
these different things and then they come to their conclusion at the end and say this is the law. So that was just there to give us a little bit a taste of Hanukkah, but also to show you how in general responsa literature works. I wanted to show you now a piece from the conservative movement. I'll scroll all the way up so you can see just how long it is, 34 pages. We are not going to go through all of this. We do not, but I wanted to show you just how it functions a little bit differently in the conservative
This is
movement.
an interesting question, actually.
It is, yeah, which is why I chose it, right? So
Use
this is
for your next class.
yeah, exactly.
Also,
The ethics
can
of-
kosher bologna be kosher?
Well,
This
so
is cultured.
cultured meat,
Cultured.
I don't
So
even
this
know
is
what that
made in the
is.
lab.
right? Lab grown meat.
Oh,
So the question is, right? And by the way, it tells you at top, right? This is from
Wow.
2017.
Wow, I'm surprised. The
Yeah.
cultured meats. Wow. around the world,
And
okay.
that there was this vote, so mostly in favor, and it tells you who all was there, right? So who on the committee.
is this the conservative movement? or-
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is the conservative movement. You had one person voting against this ruling. And so the question is, may cultured meat, also known as in vitro, clean, or lab grown meat, be considered kosher? So you can think of a lot of reasons why it might be kosher. You can think of a lot of reasons why it might not be, right? Was it, is what's grown in a lab considered meat? Where did the initial cells come from, right? That led to this, right? Do those have to be from a kosher animal? Does that animal have to be slaughtered in a kosher way? Does that animal need to be slaughtered at all, right? Or could those cells have come from an animal that wasn't killed?
So is there such a thing as a kosher cow?
As a kosher what?
Cow,
Cow?
yes, animal. I thought
Yeah.
only with the death and the butchering is the question of kashrut.
Right, because treif generally means something that's torn. That's the literal translation of treif, which we use as a shorthand for something that's not kosher, because one of the things in the Torah says that you're not allowed to like take a limb off of a living animal, right, and eat that limb. That the animal has to be killed and then butchered, not in the reverse order. So could you take cells from a living animal and use that to grow meat, right? So that is one reason why it might not be kosher. Assuming that kosher meat has to be taken by kosher slaughter, right? If you're growing meat in a lab and it is not an animal, can that meat be considered kosher if there's not a kosher slaughter involved? So all of these questions that you might think about arise in this question of cultured meat for those who obviously who eat kosher meat or who want to. And so they go through a lot of these things. They take apart all these arguments, right? They say there are many technical, financial, and aesthetic challenges to be addressed before such meat reaches the table, but the halakhic issues deserve clarification early in the process. So yes, it's early. They're saying we're not there yet, right? This is not relevant to most people at the moment, but we should figure it out now so that when it becomes relevant, that we already have this ruling on the books. And so what are the arguments for this kind of meat?
Polly,
Okay.
Ethics, right? That you don't have to kill an animal for it to happen necessarily, or at least not a lot of animals. Health, right? That maybe when you are growing meat, you could grow meat in a that is more healthy to consume. It might be better for the environment. So that's something to keep in mind when you're not having a methane producing animal. The ecology, right? All of the land that is used to cultivate meat and energy. So all of these things they're saying are reasons we might want to consider this and why we might try and find a way for it to be kosher, right? And then they say, that halakha addresses some of these things, and so then they start really unpacking it, right? So you can see that it's 34 pages of discussion and unpacking, using texts, using established rulings that they have about kashrut already, that they might apply to this situation. And so I'm obviously not going to go through all of that, but
I do want to know the end result, but I want to know.
yes.
the answer.
So we're going to look at the end result.
We said that 21.
Voting,
anyway,
well,
jump to
voting
the
in
top.
favor of the ruling, but I haven't.
We don't know what the
Oh,
ruling is.
Yeah. Yes.
But we can guess.
Keep
But-
I think yes, actually. Oh,
Right,
yes.
but so you can see what they're using, right? That milk from a kosher animal is permitted for kosher consumption, whereas milk from a non-kosher mammal is forbidden, right? So if it's not just about the product, in the form of milk, but could be anything that is done from a non-kosher animal is not kosher, and anything taken from a kosher animal is kosher. So you might assume that that's where they're going.
Well, not necessarily, because taking something from a non-kosher animal clearly is a negative starter. But there's still the question, if it's from a kosher animal, is it still okay?
Right. Well, milk, that they're taking the idea of milk, right? Milk from a kosher animal is considered kosher, like cow's milk, goat's milk, sheep's milk, but milk from a non-kosher animal or a non-kosher mammal would not be considered kosher.
Do they have lobbyists?
Maybe,
The people from the non-meat
That's a good
industry?
question.
probably.
We want the
Probably.
Jewish
Yeah.
people to buy.
Well,
this
with
product.
I can't remember if it was Impossible or Beyond.
Right.
Recently came up with, it must have been Impossible pork.
Yeah.
Right. And other
Oh.
Impossible products, Impossible burgers, Impossible beef, Impossible chicken. have a hechsher, right? They have the kosher symbol on them. And so the question was, if we're using the same stuff, it's not animal product at all, right? We're just making it to look like and taste like, maybe feel like pork. Can that be kosher? And the Orthodox Union essentially said no. It just, there's nothing inherently wrong with this. It just is icky to put a kosher stamp on something
Something
that
that
is
says
called
pork.
pork.
Yeah.
Even if it's impossible pork or beyond pork or whichever one it was. So,
I like the name, go,
oh yeah.
the end of this, page, the article, the culinary use of urine. don't
I
know,
must have
Casey,
skipped
do
over
you
that
use
one.
That in your restaurant?
My restaurant.
All
It
right.
is a thing, though.
Though not from
It is?
donkeys.
Okay, yeah. Recipe for a ritual Chinese dish, eggs, thyme, and plenty of urine. Okay,
Wow.
I'm having Chinese food tonight, I need to be careful. Okay.
Yeah.
So you can see just, how they're going into all these different things. They have headings, right, of the limb taken from a living animal. So now they're going into cells that might be taken from a living animal. And can that be considered kosher? Or is it under this ruling of, or in this under this umbrella of treif, of tearing a limb from an animal who's already alive, which is not allowed if you are eating in kosher ways. And you can just to show you, they're citing from the Talmud, they're citing from earlier rabbinic places, and those are citing from the book of Genesis. So you can see that they're taking ancient texts that had no idea about lab-grown meat and trying to apply the same values and same legal ideas to this new situation. So I'm going to scroll way down now to show you what they ruled. All the way down. Here we go. We're only at page 20.
6 pages to get to the ruling
Yes,
too, right?
yes.
So what do you guys think?
The summary. Oh yeah, you want to give your guesses
I'm
before?
I'm gonna guess it's not kosher.
I'm gonna guess no, just because even trying to keep a lab kosher is
Mm,
gonna be difficult. of just,
okay.
like, the environment.
Okay, so the practicalities of it are going to make it
practicalities.
unrealistic.
Yeah, just like
Okay.
how they don't want to put kosher milk in its pork.
Okay.
Like at my restaurant, we do serve Beyond Meat, and it is a good 20-minute conversation every time. Are you sure this is a vegan burger? Are you sure this is vegan stuff?
Uh-huh.
And so I think just the technicalities of it are going to
Okay.
make it difficulty. too.
Okay.
Well, I'll
Any
be the
other
odd
guesses?
person out and say, sure,
I
it's
just
okay.
was gonna say it's a little hard to hear.
Because we're just using my computer microphone.
okay.
Okay, I'll try and
Just speak.
summarize what,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think they're gonna vote it's kosher.
Yeah,
Because you said they have a kosher thing on the,
on Beyond
yeah, but
Burgers.
not pork.
Right.
So maybe you gave it away.
Well, we'll see.
All right, let's see.
All right. So the summary,
Yeah, I told you, five pages. 5
right?
pages,
Yeah.
so.
So, um, but I might summarize the summary.
Yes.
But right, so they talk about the cells that were removed from a live animal, right? And usually that would be not permitted. But then they say that the cells that were removed are not to the threshold of an olive's bulk, kazait. So that's just a general thing in kashrut, in kosher laws, that is it an olive's worth. That's they're like, because it's small but it's noticeable, right?
Mhm.
So it's and they talk about, like, if you're making a meat stew and a little bit of milk falls in, is it, you have to throw out the whole stew? And then so they talk about kazait, like, is it like an olive? And so they say that the cells that you would remove, right, are much less than that. So it doesn't actually reach that threshold of unallowable things. These cells will not persist into the final product except for a tiny amount, right? That you're going to populate and propagate these cells so much that the origin is just in the final product is negligible. And that these cells have been manipulated so much that that you can't really even call them, what they used to be. And they essentially say, okay, so that's not something that we're really concerned about. That what they grow in, right, might be an issue, because the consumption of blood is not something you can do in a kosher way. And so they essentially say that vegetable based growth media are preferable for reasons of kashrut and avoiding the need for slaughter. So that's something they would prefer. And they essentially say cow cells would become beef, but pig cells could not be consumed. So the origin does matter to some extent, right? They can't totally ignore that. And they say, like, look, this could be ruled parv, meaning neither dairy nor meat. But for various reasons, we're going to say that if this comes about, that we're not going to say this is parv, that we're still going to say this is meat. So they say there will be no kosher cheeseburger, but meat which is sustainable and morally beyond reproach may yet be made available for kosher consumption. Okay, so if you were hoping that this would, allow you to mix milk and meat in a kosher way, we're saying no, even if it's mostly vegetable protein and fat, but still, this is going to be considered
Non-dairy cheese.
right. Well, right, you could do that, but that's not very good.
Yeah.
As somebody who grew up partially with non-dairy cheese because of my mom's lactose intolerance.
I see.
So halachic conclusions, right? This is the ruling. They have footnotes. That's why there are a few
Okay.
extra pages there. Should cultured meat become a viable consumer product, it will be important to ascertain that it derives from kosher species of animal and that the growth medium and any additives be plant-based or synthetic and certified kosher. So Casey, this speaks kind of to your idea that that there would need to be supervision in the lab to make sure that all the ingredients and the processes are acceptable.
Yeah.
So assuming that that can happen, and there are kosher symbols on lots of different factory-made things that have lots of steps and lots of complicated processes, right, to process that food, and they still get a kosher certification. So presumably it's not insurmountable. Indeed, the entire process will require kosher supervision. Cultured meat derived from cells taken from a kosher species of animal will not be prohibited as a limb or flesh taken from a living animal. So that whole idea of treif, of torn, is not at issue here, they say. Because the original cells will not be eaten, and they alone would not suffice to create the final product. You're not taking enough from that live animal to eat, and you're not even eating those original cells, so they say it's not an issue. While cultured meat might arguably be deemed parv, like eggs, this is a matter of doubt, and we rule stringently when in doubt over a biblical prohibition. So essentially they say, we don't know if it should be parv, but we're going to, rule that it's not, just in case,
Yeah.
right? Because we're dealing with a biblical prohibition. If it were just a rabbinic prohibition, which holds a little bit less weight, they might be a bit more lenient, but because it is biblical, right? You shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk from various parts of the Torah. They're saying, let's be strict here. Moreover, because the product is designed to mimic the biological structure and eating experience of pastured meat, it would be confusing for one meat to be meaty and another apparently identical meat to be parv. Cultured meat should be designated as meaty according to the rabbis, even though there will be no need for kosher slaughter, inspection for injury, deveining, soaking, or salting to remove blood. Right? So all of these things that we associate with kosher slaughter and preparing the meat to be consumed in a kosher way, that's not an issue here, but we're not going to equate, or we are going to equate meat with meat, maybe to avoid confusion or perceived sin or what have you. If cultured meat fulfills the promises of being less cruel to animals, less destructive to the environment, and more healthful to consume, then it will not only be acceptable, but even preferable to eating conventional pastured meat. And this to me was like the big statement of, not only are we saying that we're going to allow this, but that when this becomes available, and assuming that it hits all of these criteria, that this is actually what you should choose in the most values-based kosher way of eating. So that to me was, I think, the most surprising part of the ruling, is that it's not just that like, okay, well, we'll give in, but no, this is, potentially really, really good.
No more brisket. No more brisket at your holiday.
Impossible brisket.
Impossible brisket.
Right, right.
Lobster brisket.
Well, we actually opted not to have brisket at our Rosh Hashanah this year for environmental and other reasons.
We
But-
didn't either, as we now have many vegans in the family,
Right.
you know.
So this is, going a little bit more deeply into things than the menorah, which is sort of like interesting and fun to think about. This is like maybe has some real world applications and could change a lot of things, right? So this is a pretty weighty ruling because it can change the way conservative Jews eat or anybody else who follows this ruling. Any reactions up to this point? Surprised that they went this way?
I changed my mind. I think it makes more sense.
Okay, Casey thinks it makes more sense.
I mean, I guess if you do put in the ethical component.
Yeah.
Then it does make sense.
Right. So, and I think, this is also why I brought this ruling, because you can see that, yes, they are basing it in Jewish text and tradition and what came before in Jewish legal literature. And they're also trying to take contemporary values like environmentalism and healthful eating, right? And they're trying to marry the two together, right? To make a ruling that speaks to people who are living in both worlds.
Now, this is the conservative conclusion. It would be
Yeah.
interesting to see if the Orthodox.
Orthodox,
conclusion was
yeah.
the same.
Right.
But
I know that there are, I think there was a lab, I feel like I read about it recently, that did sort of get the blessing of an Orthodox group, that it's far off from, but I think it was in Israel that they were doing some lab grown meat
Oh, there
stuff.
was,
And,
it was
yeah.
in the Jerusalem.
Yeah.
report.
Did you send
Let's
that?
go. Yeah, the whole issue about like ethical food
Right.
ways and all the different companies, startups in Israel that are doing all this stuff with lab grown meats. And
Yeah. Okay. So I think, in Israel, there's some Orthodox groups that are starting to look at this and say, you know what, this might work. So,
you look at an LGBT.
yes, we are I'm gonna close this browser and go to another browser right now.
Also thinking about how a lot of vegans don't like the Impossible meat because it takes so much resources to make,
Mm-hmm.
and they really miss the standard black bean burger. They used to be on every restaurant menu. That's been replaceably on.
Right, like the
now.
garden burger or the
Yeah,
black bean
yeah.
burger that has fallen off the menu.
Yeah.
And all right. I'm just trying to figure out which one to focus on here. Okay. This comes from the Reform movement. It's a question that was asked by a classmate of mine and a friend named Karen Gorbin, who's now a rabbi in Tacoma, Washington, so outside of Seattle. And so Karen asks the CCAR responsive committee, and you can see this is a few years ago, I guess 8 years ago, right? 5776 in the Jewish calendar. So we're in 5784 right now. And so she asks, a couple in my community was legally married 19 years ago. In recent months, one member of the couple has come out as transgender. The couple is planning to remain married and began wondering what that would mean for the status of their marriage. Obviously, if there are any legal implications, I would recommend speaking with a lawyer. But what are the implications from a Jewish perspective? The responsa that I've seen address conversion and marriage after a transition, but don't address the status of an existing marriage. Would the transition require another formal commitment, especially to have a new ketubah with the correct names and accurate gender language? Would the cisgender partner's immediate and continued acceptance of the trans partner's true identity uphold the marriage? I'm thinking of parallels in Ketubot that discuss how a husband or wife has to respond to the revelation of an undisclosed flaw that might have impacted their original decision to marry. Are there other considerations? So she is asking, do we need a new ketubah? Do they need to have a new ceremony? Should the ketubah match the gender and the name at any given point of the members of the couple? Or does the marriage still stand and the ketubah still stand, even with this transition and this person coming out as transgender? So before we jump in, any ideas where this might be going? Again, this is a reform movement from about 8 years ago.
I didn't think about what I was doing, but I'm just thinking about Dana and Charlotte.
Right.
So this applies exactly to them.
Well,
So
were
it
they a
is-
couple before
Yes, they were
Charlotte?
married before Charlotte transitioned. They're still married, so it'll be interesting to see the answer, and I'm just thinking like relative to them.
Right. So this is not a hypothetical, right? This is something that definitely affects the lives of, in this case, Reform Jews or people who associate with Reform rabbis or with the Reform movement, Reform synagogues, right? I mean, this ruling would not have any weight in the Orthodox world, right? And you can argue whether it would have any weight in the Reform world.
You mean conservative?
No, I mean, like,
Oh,
because
have any
the
real
like,
weight, yeah.
like in the Reform world, people kind of do what they want.
Sure.
Yes, and say that nothing needs to change, everything is status. quo
Okay.
anyway.
So
that's
yeah,
not-
for those who are
Excuse
joining,
me, excuse me. Can
Yes.
I ask that when someone other than the rabbi is talking, that you lean in close to the rabbi's mic? Because it's very difficult to hear the rest of you.
yeah,
Well,
okay,
let the Rabbi, repeat it, Michael.
yeah, I'll
That'd be
try to
great.
repeat, yeah. All right, so Mindy thinks that the way this ruling is going is that nothing will have to change, that it's status quo. You won't need a new ketubah or a new ceremony.
Right, it seems almost self-evident that that's going to be the answer.
Why is that? Rod thinks that this is going to be the answer.
Right, for it not to be correct causes lots of tourists, and I don't see tourists as an objective.
Okay, so
Good
Rod was saying that to rule that things would need to change would cause a lot of trouble, a lot of tourists, and that doesn't seem to be the point here. And so one thing that the deciders might take into account is, no matter what the texts say, what will this mean for people's lives, right? And what would a ruling mean for the marriages and the lives of many people, right? Would we want to invalidate marriages, maybe even of people, who don't know, who haven't read this ruling, right? Would we want to say that their marriages and their marriage documents are invalid at the moment? Okay.
How long is this ruling? Is this multiple pages also?
I'll scroll down to the bottom. Not too long. Not too long. So you can see that they break it into a couple of different questions, right? The status of the marriage. They break it in. Heading number 2 is the transgender individual a new legal person? And then number 3, is a new ketubah required? And then they have the conclusion. So manageable, unlike 34 pages. And what they say is, number 1, that the marriage, a marriage, it doesn't matter the gender of the 2 people who are married or who are getting married. There are movements within Judaism where there are certain expectations and requirements of men versus women in a marriage, but in the Reform movement, that's not at issue because we see it as egalitarian. And so what they also say is they're talking about, divorce and annulment, right? And that, that Karen had mentioned something in the ketubah about if somebody discovers that there are undisclosed flaws in a person, right? So that's the piece that they're talking about first. And so they say, if a man marries a woman explicitly on condition that she not bear any of those flaws, the marriage is subsequently held to be null and void, should it turn out that she does bear any of them. On the other hand, if a man marries a woman without making such an advanced stipulation, then should she bear any of these flaws, the marriage is valid.
So potentially the flaws are more than signs of virginity?
Yeah, potentially. That there are any number of flaws that, if the terms of the marriage were that she not have any, and in a traditional sense, I'll use those gendered terms. Then if she does have any, the marriage is not valid. But if that's not a stipulation of the ketubah, right, that she not have any of these flaws, and then it turns out she does have some of those flaws, the marriage still stands. The marriage is valid.
I mean, I'll speak loud. Michael, hopefully you can hear me, I'm yelling. But I think one flaw might be like the ability to conceive children,
Sure.
right? And so then if the person, in this case, I guess the woman can't conceive children, that could be deemed a flaw based on what was in the ketubah, then the marriage could be annulled or.
Right. So it might be because even, the one who is quote unquote flawed didn't know about that flaw. And so essentially they say, the same is true for us, although we understand these rules to operate for either spouse in an egalitarian manner. And that gender identification is relevant to a prospective spouse. And should one conceal that relevant information prior to the marriage, we would have grounds to declare the marriage or the kiddushin invalid under Jewish law. Like if one spouse knew of a gender identity that they were not disclosing to their prospective spouse, and then later came out, that, if the cisgender spouse had a problem with that perhaps we would declare the marriage invalid because of that hidden known identity.
Do Reform ketubahs have that kind of provision?
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, they're much more about we love each other and we're committing to each other and we're going to have a household together. Yeah. It's not like I'm giving 3 goats and a camel to your father for.
Right.
So in
How
yeah, go ahead, Paula.
like what does flawed include? Okay,
Right.
You're dyslexic, or is it considered a flaw, or you're I mean left-handed? Right, I never told you.
Right. And I think it's more about things that are important that you have at least ahead of time hidden from your future spouse, willfully, right? That then come out later. Yeah, I think flaw is sort of a weird word to use.
They probably have responsa on the flaw, right?
Someone does. I don't know if the reform movement
Yeah.
does. I haven't looked into it. But they essentially say like that's not an issue here, right? The couple is planning to remain married, and it's clear that everybody has accepted what's going on here. And so this piece doesn't apply, and the marriage should not be invalidated for this reason. So that piece at least is out the window. Then they go to the question of, is the transgender individual a new legal person? Like a newborn child, right? Like we consider somebody who converts to be a new person, right? They get a new name. They emerge from the mikvah, which is sort of like a rebirth experience. And so they have a new legal personality when they convert. And so should we be viewing a transition in the same way as a conversion? And therefore, then, if they're a new person, that any existing legal relationships are no longer intact. So they're saying, look, this is a dramatic transformation of self-image. And if it's considering this person a new legal person, then might their marriage be void on these grounds? But they say that this fails to convince, right? If the transgender individual is a new legal person, then it follows that all of their existing family relations are severed. In addition, or if it does, then we would have to conclude that all transgender persons' existing obligations, contracts, debts, and moral promises are similarly null and void because this person never entered into them, because they're a new person. And they say this would be absurd, both under Jewish law and the law of the land. And therefore, we're saying that this person, while they have gone through a personal transformation, is the same legal person. And therefore, on those grounds, the marriage should remain valid. So though they have a new gender identity, they are still essentially the same person.
Thinking about when somebody does change their name, they even tell you to change your student loan before you change your license.
Wait, so when you change your name, they tell you to change your student loans before your
First.
license?
Because your student loans will go after you.
Yes,
For
your
trying
student loans do
to-
go, yeah, even after you die, student
Yeah.
loans are valid.
Because they
Oh, wow.
worry about you changing your name to Skip Allentown.
Uh-huh,
And you need to like immediately let them know before it's posted in the newspaper, or they will go after you immediately.
wow, okay,
It was a big thing
yeah.
that my college was telling everybody,
okay.
like, just in case.
So Casey was saying that the college told them that if they have a name change for one reason or another, they need to let the student loan servicer know first before anyone else. I will say, as somebody who just got their loans discharged on the public service loan forgiveness program in the last month or so, that I'm part of the Facebook group of people who are trying to achieve that and navigate governmental rules and regulations, and posting how much they have in student loans. That's a big thing, that yes, somebody might change their name to try to skip out on those amounts. So yeah, so no, those. So even with a new gender identity, one still has to pay student loans. Yeah, unfortunately. So then we come to the third piece of the question, which is a new ketubah required, right? If the marriage, as they've said, is still valid, then do you need a new ketubah with the correct gender and name? And they've said that halachic authorities have actually discussed a similar question. So here's where they're taking some Jewish tradition and applying it to this new situation, right? And so they're citing Rav Yitzhak Yaakov Weiss of Britain and of Israel. I'm guessing not a Reform rabbi. I could be wrong, but that's my guess. saying a ketubah is a ketubah rendered invalid when either spouse changes their name. And so this guy says yes. Rav Yitzchak Yaakov Weiss says yes. That a ketubah is no longer valid when there's a name change, because it's forbidden for a couple to live together without a ketubah. A new one must be written as soon as possible. But others disagree for two reasons. One, the existing ketubah is not invalid, because after all, the witnesses who signed the document testified truthfully. The bride and groom agreed to be married under the names by which they were known at the time. Right, that's the big piece, at the time. And if we came to that conclusion about a ketubah, we'd have to come to that conclusion with other documents as well, other legal documents. And they're saying essentially we're not doing that. That's absurd. And second, you can't actually write a new ketubah because the couple's already married, as we stated above, right? The marriage is valid. So you can't then have a new ketubah because they're already married. And so the witnesses couldn't testify that on this date, the grooms said these things to each other. And so we, the Reform movement, hold by the latter opinion that you don't need a new ketubah. The existing ketubah, like the marriage, remains valid because each spouse sees the other as the same legal person as they were before the change. And therefore, the promises that they made in the document are still valid. So that is, I don't think we need to read the conclusion, which is essentially what we just went over. But what they do say is that if the couple wants to, they can write an addendum to their ketubah with the name change. It's not a requirement, but it's something that saying this might be something to consider, right?
If they can find their ketubah.
If they can find their ketubah. Hopefully they
It's
know
in
where it
this
is.
drawer
Yeah. Nowadays, many
Well-
people have it on their wall. But
Right.
Paula, were you gonna say something?
So an addendum means you don't have a new one made, you just put a little extra piece below the ketubah that says, since this happened, the names have changed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If the couple wants,
Okay.
but they're saying like, here's an idea. Do with it what you will.
But if they do have a new ketubah written, is it legal as
Um,
opposed to an addendum?
well, it seems like they're saying no, because they're saying that you can't have a new
Because you
ketubah.
can't, right?
That said, how much legal weight does a ketubah
Yeah.
have, that in a non-orthodox, and well, let's even say not conservative setting, Reform, Reconstructionist, somewhat secular, unaffiliated setting, where the ketubah is talking about love and even promises that the couple is making to one another, but it's not. What I tell couples is I don't see it as a legal document.
Mhm.
As a statement, a reminder of the commitments that they make at the wedding. But
Mhm.
The text on most ketubot that I see it's not a legal text. And so look, would I as a rabbi sign a ketubah for a couple that has already been married for a while? Sure. If that's meaningful, but I think what's important here is they're saying that it's not required. That if the couple doesn't want it, you don't need to make a new ketubah. That even with the dead name, that it remains valid.
Okay.
How do we feel about this?
Happy.
Yeah, we're pleased with the outcome.
I feel like it's the same thing. People don't want to like backdate or they're like, oh, 10 years later, now we wish we had one.
Oh, okay.
And then it's like,
So
well,
if people never had a Katuba and they
Yeah.
wanted
they want a
backdate
new
it.
one, and it's like, well, you can't backdate like an Orthodox like kosher festival. You can have a pretty document, you can have a pretty paperweight that says how much you love each other, and then you can have witnesses sign that. You know, you
Mhm.
can't like you can't go back, kind of a thing.
Right. So Casey was saying you can't go back and backdate a Katuba. You know, similarly, there are people who I've talked to who had a marriage at a courthouse and then never had their Jewish ceremony and wanted to do something. But you can't really call it a wedding. We might call it a vow renewal. We might call it a recommitment ceremony. But to call it a wedding, you kind of had to do it at the beginning. It was a little interesting with COVID when people were planning on having their Jewish ceremony with everybody and everything, and then opted for a very small ceremony, whether it was Jewish or secular. And
My
then
niece,
a couple years later decided to do the big one. That was sort of, what do you call that?
they called it a wedding. My
Right.
niece,
Yeah, your niece. Yeah.
yeah, with the white dress and the whole thing, yeah. So she had 2 marriages, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. My dad and my stepmom had 3 different ceremonies. I don't know if I would call them all weddings, but they did
Mhm.
one in Vegas.
Ah.
They did one, not spur of the moment, but still in Vegas.
Mhm.
They did one like just with family, outside with, I think it was a friend or a judge officiating, and then one with a lot of people later on. But yeah, which one? Which one is their anniversary? Which one is their wedding? Um, Maybe the first one, but was anyone there?
I had to clarify, I said, when do you want your gift?
Uh-huh.
I'm planning on one.
Right. You don't get 3 gifts.
She said the second one, the big one.
Okay. I want to point out just the other ones that I had up, not that we're going to go into them in detail, but I want to show you the kinds of questions that pop up. Here we go.
So any rabbi who gets posed a question by a congregant can go to this committee and say, okay.
Yeah, anyone can, and even someone who's not a rabbi can send in a question to the committee. It tends to be rabbis, but we're the ones who care more
Right,
about this
right,
and
right.
might read it. But
Oh, this is interesting.
yeah, this is another one, right? The circumcision of a transgender female, right? So we're talking about conversion, right? So we'll just, it's a long question. But the question from Rabbi Goldwasser here is, in working with a transgender female towards conversion, he kind of came to his own conclusion before asking the law committee or the responsive committee, right? I considered whether I would ask her to undergo milat gerim, right, the circumcision for proselytes as part of her conversion process. I concluded that I would not require circumcision in her case because of her involvement with the synagogue, and he goes into his own reasons, and because milat or circumcision is not required for women, right? And we see this person as a woman, regardless of what their genitalia look like. But he says, I'm still going to ask the committee, even though I've come to my own conclusion, because I think we should have this on the books, right? I should know what the reform movement at least says in the year 5769, right, which is a little while ago here. And so what is the attitude of Jewish law as understood in a reform context towards transgender people in general? And knowing that there have been some rulings in the past that might not be our opinion anymore. So I'll go all the way down to the bottom here. And so essentially they say, I don't remember if the ruling is here, if it's more throughout. our deep devotion to the mitzvah of circumcision as a powerful act of Jewish identity that links our modern day community to our earliest generations of our people. There is no reason in principle to exclude a person from the opportunity to participate in this mitzvah simply because she is transgender. We should recall that the rabbis, in their efforts to determine the status of the androgynous, included that individual in the community of those who are to be circumcised. We Reformed Jews are our best selves, and we too practice the policy of inclusion. And we should remember that as we work to find a place for transgender people within our religious community. So they,
So that's unclear to me.
yeah,
Are
Right.
they
What's the
saying they,
conclusion? So,
are they
Right.
saying they should?
yeah,
yeah, that's what I thought, yeah.
yeah.
that's-
So essentially they say, it's something that
They call it, yeah.
that anyone with a foreskin, right, has the opportunity to be circumcised for conversion, and we shouldn't exclude anybody from that possibility. I would be interested to see what they would say in the year 5784 and not in the year
But are they saying they
5769.
must?
Should,
Yeah, I think it's a should.
we should.
My assumption is that this is not practiced by most Reform rabbis at this time. So the reason why I wanted to bring this is, number one, because it's an interesting question, and also to show how responsa can be weighty at a certain time and be of its time, right? That it can be also something that there was actually a one discussion and ruling about the formation of gay synagogues. And essentially, I think it was from the 60s or 70s, and they said that, essentially that, being gay was a sin. And this was in the Reform movement. And so it was like, and it was still one that you can find and just read through, so it's still on the books.
So
So,
here's a question kind of related. So if you have someone who is converting, but a cisgender man who is converting to Judaism, who has never been circumcised,
right.
is it a requirement of the conversion? I'm guessing under the Reform, no. Conservative, I'm not so sure. Probably Orthodox, yes.
I will say that that circumcision is still an expectation and a value by most, if not all, movements of Judaism. And though individual rabbis might have different requirements, so it's not that CCAR rabbis, Reform rabbis, all have the same requirements. So any of the laws on the books, any responsa, any rulings would say that a person converting to a man converting to Judaism, cisgender man who has not been circumcised, should be circumcised.
And if they have been circumcised, they still need to be cut?
There's a ritual if they've already undergone circumcision in a non-Jewish setting called Hatafat Dambrit, which is they prick the head of the penis for a drop of blood.
Gilbert Swift was just here two Fridays ago.
Yeah.
And we were talking with Patrick and Alfredo, who are about to be converted
They
on
are,
Friday.
yeah.
And Gilbert was saying that even though he was circumcised as a kid, he had to go through that. And Patrick and Alfredo looked at each other and they were like, Rabbi Jake didn't say we have to do that. It was like, and he used the Hebrew, which I didn't know, and they didn't know either.
Yeah.
And then he explained it, and you could see Patrick and Alfredo looking at each other like, we
So
weren't prepared for that.
You're not requiring that of
I don't.
Bless you.
So yeah, my general outlook is you can teach about Jewish tradition and talk about the possibilities underneath that umbrella, why some people find it meaningful, and then let people make their own decisions. Yes, so that was one ruling that I wanted to show you. There's another one about from again.
So this last one, we're saying we don't want to declare void the opportunity to be
Yeah.
circumcised.
Right. So it's interesting, right?
The mitzvah, the
The
mitzvah.
stated value, right, is inclusion. Right at the bottom here, right? We practice inclusion. And with that value in 5769, right, what, 15 years ago, they said, therefore, that a trans woman should undergo circumcision.
Should, as opposed to
Yeah.
optional.
Yeah. And so it'd be interesting with that idea of inclusion, right, as our guiding value, would we come to, would responsive committee these days come to the same conclusion, right, with that stated value?
Also thinking about how it's interesting how for trans men who still have their period, it's generally considered that you're not required to go to the mikvah.
If a
Yeah.
trans man still has
Still has a
still
period,
menstruates,
Still menstruates.
that they're not required to go to the mikvah
Right,
for the sake of family purity.
Right, because the requirement's only for women, and also I think they mostly make requirement because like seeing somebody with a full beard walk into the mikvah
Mm.
might be concerning for some people,
Oh, interesting.
and then the kind of that safety measure having to like have a separate male attendant
Mhm.
preside over that, and having like especially for in a more orthodox mikvah, like
Right. So in
Right,
an orthodox
counselor.
setting, that might lead to more discomfort for the menstruant,
yeah,
right? It is worth it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. And might not even be safe for them.
right.
So the other two that I just had up that we're not going to go into depth on, there was a question from, what is that, 17 years ago? Two
Mm.
lesbian women are expecting a baby conceived through sperm donation. One is Jewish and affiliates with the Reform movement, but the other is not. And it is she who will be the birth mother.
Mm.
So the sperm donor is not Jewish. The two women partners will be the child's parents, and they plan to raise the child in a Jewish home. Will this baby have to undergo formal conversion and be immersed in the mikveh to confer Jewish status upon, according to Reform's principles? Will the Jewishness of the non-carrying parent partner, meaning the Jewish mother, play a role in conferring Jewish status to the child as it could in a situation of patrilineal descent where the parents are heterosexual? So in the Reform movement, it's not just, you're not just Jewish if you have a Jewish mother. The Reform movement ruled that if you have one Jewish parent and you are raised as a Jew, it doesn't matter if that parent was male or female, you are Jewish. So this question is saying, does the similar thing apply here, where this child will have one Jewish parent? It just happens to be that this Jewish parent is a mother, but a non-birthing mother. So is the child already Jewish when they are born, or do they need to go through conversion?
Good question.
Um,
I would think based on the way you just described it, that the answer would be no.
no, they don't have to go through
That
conversion.
would be my guess, because if you're saying that the Reform movement, straight marriage, in this example, saying if the man is Jewish, the woman has the kid who's not Jewish, the kid would be considered Jewish, even if
Right.
they were, as long as they were raised in a Jewish home and one parent. So you just sort of replace the non-Jewish, and I think it would work. So I would think the answer would be no, they would not have to go through formal.
Okay, so Mindy guesses no.
Yeah,
Given patrilineal descent, meaning that you have one Jewish parent, even if you didn't come out of a Jewish womb, that you are
have,
considered Jewish.
2 adopted daughters, and we raised them in an interfaith group, interfaith family project. And my kids, they consider themselves interfaith,
Hmm.
but my oldest daughter considers herself more Jewish because we did the Jewish holidays.
Mhm.
But she was upset with me that I didn't have her formally converted as a baby because she read on the internet that she's not really Jewish.
Uh-huh.
how
And,
can you convert a baby?
Oh,
You
it would be
take them
very
to the
easy.
mikveh.
Yeah, it would be very hard now for her to. I mean, she'd have if it meant a lot to her, she'd have to go and
Yeah.
ask the rabbi. She'd have to believe.
Depends on the rabbi, but
Yeah.
I feel like I'm cheating because that's what Evan did. Evan did that after his bar mitzvah. Even
he went to the
he
mikveh
went
after
to
his
the
bar
mikveh
mitzvah.
after his bar mitzvah because his dad was like, well, just in case in our current political climate.
Wait, so Evan's dad is Jewish
At least
and
dad is
mother
Jewish,
and
at
mom
least
is
mom
not.
is not Jewish.
Ah,
But so in the reform movement, he would already be considered Jewish.
Yeah,
But he
Yeah,
went
oh
to the
my God.
mikveh
Yeah.
after his
Which
birth.
one?
Okay.
just to check that mark.
Check
just
it
in
off.
case.
So I'll just show you
Yeah,
where we
let's see
go
what they
here.
say.
It's a bit of a longer ruling, right? A longer ruling here, but in general, the tendency of this committee is to urge in the strongest terms that all proselytes undergo the traditional rites for entry into the covenant. We do so not because we suppose that Orthodox Jews will recognize the validity of all our conversions, but because we regard these practices as a positive Jewish standard that applies to us as it does to all Jews. This testifies to our conviction that when we accept a convert, a ger, or a Gioret into our midst, we convert him or her to Judaism. Although we presume that our proselytes will remain firm in their commitment to a reform approach to our faith and a tradition, we do not require that they do so. We do make their conversion stringent upon their staying with our fold. We are not in the business of creating a separate sect cut off from the rest of our Jewish family. Rather, when we accept a proselyte, we admit this person into Am Yisrael, into the Jewish community as a whole, a living historical enterprise of which we are an organic part. We therefore believe that it is appropriate and preferable to mark the moment of conversion, not simply with liturgy of our own creation, but precisely with those rituals that are and have been for centuries employed by the Jewish community as a whole.
So they're saying the kid should
Yes.
go through.
And that we don't just say some prayers, but we actually go through mikvah and other things because it connects us to the larger Jewish whole and might connect this person to the larger Jewish community. So even though we might be inclined to rule in a more lenient way, we're going to rule more stringently for these reasons.
So once again, we're talking about basically taking a newborn to the mikveh as opposed to a, Christian analogy would be somebody who's ready to confess.
Right.
Allegiance is the wrong word.
Right. Yeah. We don't ask the baby, are you going to be Jewish for your whole life? Or,
Or
what mitzvot, what
baptism.
mitzvot are you committing to right now? Yeah. We just take
And
the
is
baby
that-
to them.
Is that done to your knowledge that babies are taken?
Oh yeah. Yeah. A lot of times with adoption.
Mhm.
Yeah, you just take the baby. It's really lovely, actually. It can be a really nice ritual. So yes, they would say
So they're saying
because
it's
neither of
preferred.
the biological parents is Jewish,
Mhm.
right? It might have been different if the sperm donor were Jewish. It definitely would have been different if
If the Jewish
if
mother
the
was giving
mother if the
birth,
birthing mother were Jewish.
Yeah.
But because neither even though we're saying that it doesn't have to be born of a Jewish womb, that there is some peoplehood aspect to Jewishness that you have some, if you are to be considered Jewish at birth, that there's some, I don't know, it's not Jewish DNA, but there's some Jewish blood in you in one way or the other. And given that that's not the case for this baby to be, or probably already is, that therefore we should take them to the mikvah.
But
Rabbi, I have a question.
Yes.
When did the reform movement, I mean, I know there wouldn't be an exact year, but when did they begin to take these things into consideration, the idea of inclusivity? I mean, I realize that they never had the restrictive rules that the other movements had, but when did they say, we want to be all inclusive? When did that start? And secondly, when did, if it did, when did the laws in Israel become important to the reform movement, so that they would say, we're a part of this larger tradition, which they wouldn't necessarily have said before, but now hoping that the children of their marriages and of their adoptions would be accepted in Israel, might they become more stringent? When did those two changes start taking place?
So in this ruling, they weren't actually talking about the state of Israel. They were talking about the people Israel, meaning the Jewish people. So this ruling wasn't dealing at all with the Israeli rabbinate and the conversion requirements there.
But you don't think it had any influence?
I don't think so, because I think the reform movement and I, as a reform rabbi, assume that the Israeli rabbinate, which is Orthodox, is not going to accept conversions that we do,
Doesn't matter.
no matter how stringent we are with them.
Right.
Because we are Reform
Mhm.
rabbis and Reform Jews, we are
Mhm.
seen as invalid in making these decisions. And
Mhm.
therefore, they're not going to accept Reform conversions. The Israeli rabbinate doesn't accept conservative conversions and doesn't even accept some Orthodox conversions. So, I don't think there's any hope in the reform movement that they're going to recognize what we do, because we're also not willing to go as far to the traditional side, let's say, as they are. So,
Okay.
it's just so far away that that's not even really a consideration. It's more about being seen as Jewish in other parts of the Jewish world, not just in the reform movement. So, like when they go to Hillel, on their college campus, that they can say, yes, I'm Jewish, and have other Jews who come from outside the reform movement say, okay, we accept you.
And my first question about the
That
change in
do you mean
inclusivity,
like LGBTQ inclusion? Is that what you're asking about, or just in general?
in general, when did that become a tenet of the reform movement?
I don't know. I mean, there were probably some Reform Jews who would say that has always been a virtue, that it was more universalistic and trying to be welcoming to others, whereas you might say that only in the last few years, and probably that there are still, even if it's a stated value, that in practice is not where it should be.
But haven't things become revolutionary after the reform movement accepted patrilineal descent as legitimate
Mhm.
Jewish basis?
That's kind of what I was wondering.
Yeah, I mean, but then you get into how people actually feel, and there are still people who belong to Reform synagogues who say, well, I'm not, I wasn't really Jewish because my mother wasn't Jewish, or I was only half Jewish, or you still have people who kind of have the matrilineal thing in their minds of this is what it really means to be Jewish. So even though it's a ruling, right, this is where we get to, what is the actual weight of these rulings and this
Mhm.
responsive literature in a non-halachic system. That the reform movement can say, hey, you just need one Jewish parent. It doesn't matter if that's a father or a mother. And there are people who are still going to, bring whatever they bring with them into the synagogue and into their lives. So, you could say that the switch flipped with patrilineal descent. You could say the switch flipped, when they started ordaining gay clergy in, I think, 1990. You could say the switch flipped when they ordained the first modern woman rabbi in 1972 in Sally J. Presand. So you can, choose your inclusion moments depending on what you're looking for. Excuse me. And only probably in the last 10 years, the reform movement has really put an eye on anti-racism and racial justice, and acknowledging that most of the faces in the congregation are white, or at least appear to be white. And so, that's why I'm sort of, I don't have one moment to point to, because I think when we say inclusion, we can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people.
Okay.
I'm going to end there. And thank you all for spending this
Thank you.
Shabbat afternoon
Thank
looking
you.
at this type of literature with me. I hope that I've shown that, even those of us who do not consider ourselves bound by halakha, that it's, a fruitful thing to look at, and we can see how Jewish tradition and values can apply to our own situations and to questions that come up. So I hope that that's been interesting
Yeah,
and
yeah.
beyond, you know,
Yes.
looking at the legal.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All
That
right.
was interesting.